Welcome to Archaeology Books for Fun, a podcast where we discuss books that are about archaeology but anyone can enjoy. I'm your host, Tristan Herrenstein, and with me as always is my co-host, Barbara Clark.
Hello, everybody.
And today we are moving on to the next section of our book, Four Lost Cities. And we are talking about Angkor, which is one that I was looking forward to because it's one that I knew basically nothing about. But before we move on, to all those who are listening and enjoying this podcast, please consider giving us a like, subscribe, or review, or whatever is appropriate for your platform. That really helps us get out there, help people discover us, and it helps us get some feedback on how people are feeling about it. And without further ado, let's get started with Chapter 7, An Alternate History of Agriculture. So these chapters are, like I said, all about Angkor, which is the capital city of the, how do you say it, Barbara?
Khmer
Empire. It looks like Khmer to us English speakers, but we looked this one up. We will have other names and stuff we will probably not pronounce properly, but we're going to do the best we can. So we're looking at Angkor and the Khmer Empire, and the Khmer people are still around today, unlike our previous two sections where we were talking about the Romans and Catalhayuk, whatever culture that was. Those groups are, of course, not around anymore, but the Khmer still exist as a cultural group today.
And just so everybody is aware, this is in modern day Cambodia.
Right. Extending into Laos a little bit, I think, but the Angkor itself is in Cambodia, yes. An important theme for this city in particular is that this is not a dead city. This is a city that is no longer a city, but it still exists in some modern today. It never disappeared, even though that was the popular narrative at one point. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later on.
And also there wasn't one event essentially that caused, and I use air quotes, the end of Angkor. Because like you said, it's still around.
Yeah. And we'll talk about this towards the end, but it actually reminded me a lot of Catalhayuk in some of the situation about its decay and everything.
Yeah.
So Angkor started around 900 CE. As we talked about before, we usually go by CCE for BC these days and CE for AD. It was a pretty huge city, almost had 1 million people at its peak.
And one thing I noticed too is, like Pompeii, there were residents and tourists, and this one also had pilgrims.
Yeah, religious pilgrims was a big thing. So a lot of our accounts of a lot of the common life of the city comes from actually a Chinese diplomat by the name of Zhou Daguan. He visited towards the end of the city's life, though, but even then he talked about elaborate walls and just general lifestyle and what it's interesting because she says that he was basically writing a travel guide for Chinese people, which is amazing to think of, like a 1200 era travel guide.
Yeah, that would be pretty cool to thumb through.
Yeah, maybe a translation of that, though.
Yeah. Well, and you have to take into consideration, too, when you're talking about this is a very different environment than the other two cities we've studied. It's essentially a tropical forest, lots of rain, which will definitely play into what happened at Angkor. But so people had to adapt to living in a very wet environment, I guess is really the best way to describe it. Wet and humid, and which in some ways is great for agriculture.
And when it came to identifying Angkor and the scale and size of Angkor in its physical remains, that was a bit of a problem because Europeans were coming looking for stone structures and permanent structures, whereas, because of the environment people are in, they're doing a lot of elevated, flood-proof houses, a lot of canals. But the Europeans were coming in and they're looking at the walled temples and they thought that was the city. And then the temples say, we had almost 1 million people. And there's no way this is correct. And so there's a lot of adjusting of the narrative that has happened, it sounds like, in just the last few decades, actually, because otherwise it was purely dominated by this perspective and this, I think, Eurocentric would be the appropriate term there.
Definitely.
And it's not necessarily their fault. I'm sure we'll talk about it a little bit, but when you come in with one perspective on what a city looks like, you wouldn't necessarily be looking for these something that's entirely different from what you're used to. On the other hand, there was definite racism and colonialism involved in that as well. So,
and I think the environment does play some role in this too. I mean, you and I live in Florida, and we know how fast nature can take over if nobody's there to reclaim or continually claim a space. So I think when they arrived, a lot of what is there or was there at the time wasn't really visible to the naked eye. And we'll talk a little bit about how technology has assisted in reinterpreting this site.
Yeah. I did appreciate the author flat out says none of this was built by aliens. You know, if you enjoy the whole alien narrative, you can enjoy that, but just be aware it's not real.
And it's kind of racist.
And it has some really kind of problematic roots and where that comes from. And we'll get to that eventually, too.
So one of the biggest issues with this city was flooding and controlling the flow of water. I guess you would say not only controlling the flow of water, but the storage of water, because they would have monsoon seasons. So it'd be really, really wet at one point of the year and then dry another point of the year. So you had to not only create an environment where you could survive the floods, but you needed to be able to store the water for the drier seasons too. And I thought it was interesting how they talked about how some of the leaders at Angkor would take into account the cosmology of their belief system here when they were building things, but they wouldn't necessarily take into consideration the practicality of what they were building and how it would work. And of course, that caused problems. So in order to control the water and store the water, they, of course, would build these huge dams, and some were massive. And during the rainy seasons, sometimes these would burst. And then it would cause the canals that they had built and things like that to clog with silt. So dams would burst and they would have to repair these dams. And of course, over time, that became more and more difficult and complicated. It seems to me like over time, a lot of these water-related structures just became less stable. And of course, that kind of cascaded into other areas that were really important, including agriculture, making agriculture a little bit more difficult. Because if your dam floods or your dam breaks and flood your fields, you know, it's kind of to use a water term, cascading. It's a cascading problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think she talks a little bit too about how even though like your dam bursting, of course, is a big issue, otherwise, like these things that were happening that were causing the city to kind of decay weren't really life-changing events. You know, it wasn't like Pompeii where there was a massive volcanic explosion. It was just these little things that kind of piled up and became annoyances, but you dealt with them, or just kind of things weren't living up to their expectations. I kind of liken this to how I know in the US, we talk a lot about infrastructure, and there's always infrastructure bills and things trying to be passed, and how our infrastructure is falling into disrepair too. And I feel like the story of Angkor is kind of a warning to us. Like, you know, that little pothole might not seem like a lot, but then, you know, everything starts piling up.
Yeah. And so just to kind of roll out this section, the last kind of paragraph I thought summed up the premise for Angkor very well. I'll just go ahead and read that. In the soft apocalypse of Angkor, we can see directly what happens when political instability meets climate catastrophe. It looks chillingly similar to what cities are enduring in the contemporary world. But in the dramatic history of the Khmer culture's coalescence and survival, we can see something equally powerful: human resilience in the face of profound hardship.
Yeah, I actually wrote that quote down in my notes too. I love that. Human resilience in the face of hardship. And I also think the term soft apocalypse is such a good way to kind of sum up what's happening here.
Right. In Angkor and now.
Well, yeah. Here and there,
right,
I guess I should say. Oh, and I want to point out too, they had towns, hospitals, canals for both drinking water and irrigation, elevated houses, and this didn't just appear, right? This came from thousands of years of them perfecting their techniques required to kind of live in that environment and to farm in essentially what is a jungle, which I'm sure has a lot of challenges.
Yeah, I like the discussion about how forests were charred and mixed in, because I had heard about some of this going on in the Amazon rainforest and how this was done thousands of years ago and that soil is still fertile today, as opposed to how it's typically done with a clear cutting. And then in a couple of decades, it's barren landscape. And I was intrigued to learn that this actually is shown up as a technique around the world in these environments. And the author actually does list a book where it talks about this. And I think I'd like to have a look at that and maybe explore that for a future book for us to read at some point. Because this is a interesting subject to me, an interesting technique that, we have kind of forgotten about apparently, or at least Western culture was never aware of, put it that way perhaps.
Well, I would be really interested in learning because she talks about how over time they changed the tree population in the forest by spreading specific seeds that
Yep.
they considered more desirable. I would love to know more about how archaeologists and biologists and whoever else can track those changes. And she also talks about how it wasn't farming. It was, I guess she calls it like proto farming, but they had small little animals too, including like chickens and things. And I'm a chicken mom. So of course, I'm interested in that. But she does talk about pollen analysis, which I think is always fascinating. And I know you do too.
Yep.
So it's on page 45, I think, but it's really cool just to think about how this group of people came into an environment that was completely wild, and it probably still looked fairly wild. It wasn't like farming today, but they would have changed the forest. Like we always think of the forest as kind of a wild, untamed place, but they took it and kind of made it more useful to them.
Yeah, so my understanding is they were doing the burning of the forest, and like we talked about, and then they were coming in with seeds that they wanted to grow and spreading those seeds. And basically, I think archaeologists can look at those time periods and see the density of different kinds of pollens and seeds from those specific time periods. That's how I understood that they're doing that. But yeah, I'm sure there's a lot more interesting detail we could get into.
I want to know how much detail they can get into it. Like
Right.
How can you tell when different plants were introduced and in what order and all that kind of stuff. I feel like that would be fascinating.
Yeah, interesting. I hadn't thought about that. We might be able to get that deep into it.
Yeah, I have no idea, but it'd be cool if we could.
All right. And so then during the time when cattle hike was at its peak, there actually were people in this area that were digging ditches to drain swamps and things even, which is pretty advanced and detailed level of work that people were putting into their environment.
And I do like the fact that she talks a little bit about how urbanism can mean different things in different parts of the world. And it's really hard to compare different cultures, even of the same time period as, like apples to apples, because they're working in different environments. They have different needs. And I think that's really important for us to remember, not even when we're looking at contemporary urban sites, but when we're looking at sites in the past, our idea of urbanism is a lot different than what would have been considered urbanism for that point.
Yeah. And that has shaped the narrative of this area for 100+ years. Basically, Europeans came in expecting to see stones and fired ceramics, and they weren't able to look for at that point the planting of trees and different plants and use of fertilizers, draining of swamps through ditches and that kind of things, and artificial hills, which to them, it's either natural or not important at that point. And since then, we've started to figure out how much work those things involved and signs of how dense the population was.
Or I think this chapter does a really good job of showing that what survives in the archaeological record is only a little bit of what once was there, possibly. And so I think when studying archaeology, that's really important to remember. Not only that, but today as archaeologists, we usually only go in and take samples of things. So when you're reading an archaeology book or watching a documentary or something like that, it's really important to note that we do not know everything. We do not know everything that was there, but technology can help us with that. And she talks a little bit about that today, talks a little bit about that.
With the best header in the book, I think, so far. Everything is better with lasers.
Yeah, and you can't argue with that.
No.
But I do think it's cool because a lot of times people don't realize the technology that's available to archaeologists. And LiDAR, or light detection and imaging, it's a laser, guys. Super cool.
Light detection and ranging. to be.
Oh, yep, you're right. But it's a relatively new technology, at least as far as being used for archaeology, I guess.
And its accessibility has changed dramatically.
Yeah.
But you might have seen some of this. They've used it in like Central America, and they've discovered a whole bunch of Mayan cities. They've used it in North Africa. You look at the landscape and you would never know there's anything there. But LiDAR is able to basically pick up just minuscule changes in the terrain that we can't see. But then you put it in through a computer program and boom, there's your streets, there's your building that's all nicely visible quite often anyway. And it has ability to cut through the canopy in ways that other technologies don't. So we can actually see through the trees essentially in forested areas like Angkor or Central America.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest benefits of this is I've heard stories of archaeologists essentially walking over structures thinking that it was just a hill until they looked at the LiDAR because it was so covered in bush and trees and whatever else, they couldn't tell from the ground.
Even less dramatic things. I've seen a report on someone doing some LiDAR on a battlefield site for the Mexican-American War, and there's supposed to have been a ditch, but they couldn't find it. And they used LiDAR, and boom, there it is. And they went out there to look, and they still couldn't see it, but they just knew where it was then. And then that was important because that told them a lot about where things were happening. So the first LiDAR survey of Angkor was in 2012, and another one was done in 2015. So fairly recently. I had no idea how quickly this technology had advanced because this sounded like really packed together. The LiDAR was the size of generators, and they jury-rigged it onto the skiff of a helicopter and had to take the seats out for the power supply and the hard drive. And then they were flying this over the jungle and getting these surveys done. Nowadays, you get a little puck and you stick it onto a drone and you fly that over. That has changed dramatically since this time.
Yeah, I didn't realize that either. And when she was explaining how they did it, I was like, oh my gosh, all the things that could have gone wrong, both safety-wise and just survey-wise.
It reminds me of the GPS backpacks we used to have to use for survey. Like you had this huge, heavy backpack with these giant antennas sticking out of the top, and you would go around and take points that way. And when I started doing survey in the early 2000s, we were down to a handheld thing, and I'm sure they're even slicker and more accurate today.
Yeah, no, I remember walking through the woods with the antenna, and it's the woods, and you have this giant antenna sticking up above your head and just branches hitting it and you almost falling over sometimes. Technology has come a long way, and I feel like it's amazing at what rate it's moving along.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, and I thought also, so it was interesting when she was looking at the LiDAR maps. She was like, oh, what are these things? And they were termite mounds.
Oh, yes.
So it'll pick up things that are not archaeological as well. And so you have to kind of be able to discern between the two. And I think one of the values of having an archaeologist who's worked on a site for a long time and is familiar with the environment is being able to distinguish between what is archaeological and what is like geological or termite mounds or what have you.
Yeah, so that's true for other technologies, of course, like ground penetrating radar. The number of times we've dug at a site to investigate it and found a tree root, or you look at like bones and such, and you'll see them use this technology, and then boom, there's a perfectly articulated skeleton, like an X-ray basically, and they can tell exactly and analyze it right then and there. And that is not how that works in reality. You get a nice blob, and then you still have to check it out. And often it's not anything like the termite mounds.
I do have to laugh when you're watching like those crime scene shows and they're using some technology like GPR, ground penetrating radar. And yeah, it's like a little skeleton on their screen. I'm like, yeah, nope, if only.
The author spends a little time describing what is called a lingam shrine. And so you can look these up, of course, but they're generally like square pedestals with abstract shapes and then a stylized moat. And they had a natural spout that would jut out of there, and then the priest would pour liquid offerings. I'm not sure what that entails exactly into that, and that would go into the moat. But then she had a thing She said, especially for people living in the river valley where runoff from the Kulin Mountains fed the land, this would have been a powerful image, which I thought I can see the reasoning there, but also that's a big leap of conjecture. And that was kind of an issue I had with this section a bit more than others too. And I'll get into that a bit more because I feel like the conjecture was a little more out of control almost.
I would agree with that. Yeah, there. I have made a few notes about how there was a lot of conjecture, and I wrote several times, I'm going to need more information.
Right. Yeah, and that's part of it too. I'm like, this may have the information to be fully backed up, but that information isn't even alluded to when she's doing that kind of thing, right?
Yeah. And also, something that was helpful to me, I mean, I've been to Thailand and I've been to similar temples, but definitely not, I'm by no means an expert, and it's such a foreign thing to me. Going online and just Googling images and maps for this site was super helpful to me when they were talking about how it was set up and how the geology and their belief system did not necessarily work well together when it comes to creating dams and canals. So just keep that in mind. You might want to Google and just peruse some images of this site too when you're reading about it.
And if you're watching the video version of this, I will be including some images as we go, but definitely not everything out there.
So speaking of like the spiritual process that kind of helped build this city, I guess it was they have a very interesting way of deciding who was king. There wasn't like a succession to the throne. It was kind of just you fought for the throne.
At least it wasn't through lineage.
Yeah. It's very different from what we think of when we think of like European kings and royalty.
Which was another bias that the Europeans brought in when they were trying to talk about the area.
Yeah. So every king that came in, of course, they would add to the site and maybe possibly change something else in the site. But a lot of them tried to construct the city based on their belief system, as I've mentioned before, and they didn't necessarily take into consideration how that would work on the landscape. It wasn't necessarily very practical.
Yeah, decisions were made for political or religious reasons rather than sound engineering reasons, is how I understood that, sometimes anyway.
I guess it kind of makes sense when you look at it from their perspective, right? You're trying to, especially when you don't have a line of succession, it's more seemingly, in my mind, I thought of it as a little bit more random. You want to exert your influence and your power and kind of make a name for yourself, right? Because
you have to demonstrate that you have a right to do this.
Yeah, it makes sense for that reason, but it was not sound urban design.
It's also one of the reasons that the city eventually started having problems.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the bunch of the rulers would make what's called a beret, which is kind of a reservoir, a giant reservoir. And I kind of got to thinking of some of this as almost think of like the Egyptian pyramids, where every pharaoh had to have their pyramid, is how I understood that anyway. And, that was part of a legitimacy of their rule. And it's seemed like a very similar mindset in this case.
Well, and I thought it was interesting too, because these berets, as they got bigger and bigger, the city continued to grow, right? Because it could provide more water, therefore more for farming, more for drinking and that kind of thing. But then it required also more labor. And it was kind of this self-reinforcing cycle where more people, you needed more water, you could have more people, but you needed more people to build the berets. And it kept growing essentially because of water.
Right. Angkor was actually founded in 800 CE by a king. So that's one important thing. It didn't just kind of organically appear like many other cities do. Like, this was a king, I'm taking power, this is where the capital is going to be. And there were people already living there, but it was small communities. And it seemed like they were generally centered around a elevated shrine. So they did a bit of a mound and a shrine on top, and then the communities are built around it. And that's important because even though it's on such a much larger scale, you see that same pattern in Angkor itself.
Well, also religious influences at Angkor were Hinduism and Buddhism. And she talks a little bit about I think she calls it the Indianization of Angkor and how...
Well, that was Western perspective.
Right. Yeah. Right. So I guess if I have this right, the idea was that India was influencing this site.
So Angkor started to have, as it grew, its population grew larger and actually started to have quite a large population in the 800s, which implies, if it starts at 802 CE, in 80 years, you're having a huge population. So that implies incredibly fast growth. And there are two ideas about what drew people to Angkor. One is that it included rice fields in the city, which provided more stable food, but also covered a larger area. And I didn't particularly like this theory, at least as it was explained, because I felt like if defense is a concern, which it certainly was in this culture, then having a huge city spread out would be almost indefensible. Like the reason other cities build inside walls and then the farms are on the outside is because that's keeping the population dense for defensive purposes. I wasn't clear on how that was a strategic advantage.
I'm glad I'm not the only one that was confused by that because, yeah, that whole section, I wasn't sure. I was having a hard time, I guess, putting it together in my mind about how having a larger area would be more defensible.
Yeah, but the other explanation is the larger population in the large area was about having more waterworks, which that makes a little more sense to me.
Yeah, especially when one of your major crops is apparently rice.
Right.
You need a lot of water to grow rice.
Yeah, and so an increased population needed better water storage, and then better water storage was needed to sustain an increased population, and then it became kind of a self-sustaining cycle, I think, like you mentioned at one point.
She has a brief discussion on burials, and I kind of felt like this was just kind of thrown in there, and maybe it's just my interest in burials, but she talks about how they stopped seeing them and they're unsure what happened with the dead. Did you catch that at all?
Yeah, and it didn't really seem to fit too much. Basically, they stopped burying their dead just a couple hundred years before the city started.
Yeah, but it's just kind of thrown in there.
Yeah, and it said some people think it might have been Hindu or Buddhist influences, but basically the book says it could have been other cultures too. And then it stops with that. And I'm not sure how that connected with the development of the city itself.
Right. And see, I thought she was going to go and start talking about, with that number of people within a city, you're going to expect to find burials or some form of mitigating, the dead. What do you do with them? And she just kind of let it hang. And of course, this is probably me just being personally interested in that subject area, but I would have loved to know more because it just was kind of thrown in there and then abruptly stopped.
That's something we've seen a few times in this book, and it's not overdone or bad, not completely without focus, but I've run into it a few times, I think.
Yeah, it's a random tangent, and you're like, okay, where was that going? And it never circles back around to the main topic here. Right. So I was like, did I miss something?
Yeah, and sometimes if it's just, that was interesting little detail, but then when it's something we're already personally interested in, maybe it hits a little harder.
Yeah.
All right, so next we move on to chapter 8, which is titled Empire of Water. And this is all about the water systems and the environment. And a good description, I guess, of the environment at this time comes from, once again, the Chinese envoy. And he observed that there was basically rain for 6 months and then no rain for 6 months. And that right there kind of emphasizes why the waterworks were so important, because they both had to deal with the excess rain, and then they had to deal with a lack of rain, especially when you're growing water-hungry crops like rice, right?
And I guess there were like 2 distinct monsoon seasons. And she talks a little bit about like where they come in the environment. I guess there's one that comes from the southwest, and then there's one that comes from May to October, and then one from November through March out of the Himalayas. And she talks a little bit about how Cambodia exists between 2 very extreme climates. And one thing I found interesting, and it makes sense, is that the Khmer, their whole social system was essentially based on the regulation of water. I think that's important to note just because group of people, their culture is oftentimes shaped by their environment and vice versa. I was glad to see that she talked a little bit about that. But then we do have another king that comes in.
Yep. This is about 100 years after what we were just talking about.
Mm-hmm. And he builds, of course, another beret.
Right.
And And this one's apparently, I guess they say 50 million cubic meters of water, which is about 20,000 Olympic swimming pools, which I looked at the images on Google and I was like, oh, yeah, that's
The
pretty big.
big reservoir, yeah.
But what I found interesting is he actually some people had to abandon their homes to make way for this huge monstrosity. And he even, like, I guess, redirected a river to run through the city to fill it.
Right. And the abandoning the homes is a common thing these days, even. Anytime a dam is built, there's people that are displaced.
Yep. I mean, you can imagine, like, the amount of labor that would have required.
Right. Yeah, you're not just damming up a choke point. You are digging a giant pit.
Yeah. Well, and she talks about, there's a quote in there about the true marvel of Angkor was its workers, and yet we rarely hear about them in the historical accounts or inscriptions. And again, I think I talked about this in one of our other previous episodes, but that's one of the most powerful things about archaeology to me, is being able to tell the story of these people that weren't written in the historical narratives. And here we are learning about them because they built the city, essentially.
Yep. And in the last few decades, it's been more of a focus for Angkor and archaeology in general is on these people and on the more common life. So we move on to talking about what has sometimes been referred to as the slave system in Angkor. And she makes a case that this is not an easy equivalent and slave is not quite accurate for what was this system like. However, I did look up some of the references she cited, and they were not old, and they referred to them as slaves. So I'm not quite clear on where that information comes from, although I could definitely think that's a good case to make. In this situation, it's a little more clear to me that this is different from what we think of as slavery than it was with the middlers in the last chapter, how they were different from the middle class.
Yeah, I think often these were like ethnic minorities, is my understanding, or possibly people imprisoned during war. But then there was also people who were, I think she calls them like debt slaves or indentured workers. And they were just temporary till they paid off their taxes, I guess.
Yeah, even indentured workers doesn't really seem to quite fit, because that's kind of an exceptional situation where this was just like, I'm paying my taxes right now, so I'm working for the king, is kind of how it sounded like. So it seemed a little just more like a normal part of your, you might just be doing this for a while, as opposed to putting yourself in debt as an exceptional thing that you would do in your life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, this was interesting to me, and I'm going through my notes, and I was obviously somewhat confused. But she talks about debt slaves versus modern debt a little bit. And I was like, okay, that might be kind of a little bit of a stretch, because these people, I would imagine, were going into debt for things they need versus today, a lot of us just go into debt for things we want.
Or it was going into debt just because you have to pay your taxes.
Right.
And part of my paying my taxes is I go and help the king build this thing or maintain this beret or something. Yeah, I felt the example of us going into debt for school or houses was a little reductionist, because I don't think it was the same thing at all.
No, I don't think so either. Because...
And not saying that, and she's trying to do this as a way of saying, it seemed harsh to us, but it wasn't. But I think her examples just don't help the case that much, because it doesn't feel like the same thing.
And I don't know that there is a modern equivalent, really. Right. So I think that's part of the problem. Maybe if she had just done away with trying to find an equivalent, it would have been more clear, because this is such a...
Well, like I said, my understanding as someone who's not an expert in this stuff is that it was just part of your responsibility, your social responsibility. You go into debt and you do this work, and that's part of what you do. It didn't feel like, in Rome, you'd be a slave for a life.
And I don't really think they had, like, when we think of slaves, we think of somebody owning that person. This was more like working off a debt, not necessarily like someone owning you. And it just seems, I know I'm like mincing words probably, but
you can kind of pick up that we were a little unclear on some of this, basically.
And I think it is just such a different concept that you and I are trying to find a modern equivalent, and I don't know that there is one.
Right. But then she goes on to talk about how debt was just an important part of the society. It wasn't just working off a debt, even everybody owed a debt to other people. Even the king owed a debt to his people to maintain the water system. Outlying rulers owed debts to the king, and vice versa. There was basically, think of it as almost, I felt like, responsibilities towards people. And it wasn't necessarily debts in the way I think of debts these days. It seemed a little like the word choice is almost a little too strong in this situation.
So, what came to mind when I was reading that section was I love historical fiction. One of my favorite TV shows is Downton Abbey. And they talk about how the people who live in the abbey itself have a responsibility to provide jobs for the villagers that surround that area. And I remember that being a big theme of how are they going to keep this small village going during, World War I and this and that. And that's what came to mind for me.
Right.
But that's like the closest equivalent I can think of. And I don't really think of that as like debt, even though it is, I guess, a form of debt.
Yeah. And in discussing the responsibility to the outlying rulers, there's a quote here. There are records of some kings bestowing weird ceremonial positions at Angkorian court, including fan bearer, barber, and wardrobe keeper. I have a bone to pick. First of all, applying weird to this is kind of not okay to begin with.
I was kind of surprised that she used that word.
It's a little ethnocentric in that my way is normal and other ways are weird. It just felt that way, and it really kind of rubbed me the wrong way. But then I got on a little bit of a tangent and got to thinking about, if anyone is aware of the computer game series Crusader Kings, there are some honorary positions as a European ruler you can bestow on your people. And so I went on a little tangent and looking up some of this stuff. Some of it might seem silly at first until you think about it, such as cupbearer was a common position for people. And you think, oh, that's really dumb. Someone whose job is just to pour the wine for everybody. But like, think about, no, they're pouring the wine for everybody. You have to trust that person not to poison everybody, essentially. Think of the barber. He's got blades around the royal family's head. Things that seem really silly. I discovered keeper of the king's or queen's swans. Are you aware of this position at all, Barbara?
I've heard of it. I know the swans are kind of a big deal.
It's kind of amazing.
But I don't know any details about what that would entail.
So there are, I've got it all here. I'm ready.
Okay.
So there are rules on which kinds of swans in which situation the royal family owns. And I don't remember all the details, but in certain areas, the mute swans are the royal family's swans. And apparently, the keeper of the swans' primary task is to perform the swan upping, which is a marking and health checking carried out on Thames skiffs on many of the non-tidal reaches of the River Thames. They go out on these canoes and still today, apparently, herd the swans so that they can check them for health and mark them if they're owned by the king or queen. And this was started in the 13th century and was supported by 3 swan herdsmen. So that's an actual word that exists. and there's this whole detail, in 1993, it was abolished because apparently this was too much for work for one person and it was made 2 separate offices. So now there's a warden of the swans and a marker of the swans. And you just think about your kind of ceremonial, seems ridiculous things, and we see these on basically anywhere. This is all over the place.
I feel like anywhere you have royalty, you're going to have some very unique positions and titles. And I mean, honestly, I'm sure people that live outside of the United States look at some of the positions we have within our, national,
certainly find some.
Our government. You're going to find some interesting ones.
Yeah,
I'm sure.
Some things that are tied to tradition, but they don't have the same purpose anymore that they used to, or they kind of tweaked as time goes on and get a little strange to our perspective today. And so, yeah, the whole application of weird in this scenario, they'll bug me and then it sent me off on a weird tangent, which I can apply because that applies to me. So a part of the Angkor King's responsibilities was to travel to these other courts. On the surface level, this was, to be worshipped, but also there was social reasons, essentially. They were having to make those connections, but it was also kind of a risky maneuver, as I understand it, too, because social unrest was not uncommon for this empire, and you move your whole family. That would probably be, I can just imagine the big procession that would end up being with all the guards and everything, too. And again, that would be itself be a big statement.
So moving on, during the 11th century, another king comes along, and he's another what they call expansionist king. And she talks a lot about how a lot of these kings were trying to grow Angkor. And of course, again, he decides they have to build another beret, and this one has to be even bigger. So this one is 57 million cubic meters of water, which is about 2,300 or 23,000 Olympic pools. He's interesting because during the construction phase, he erased structures associated with the other king, and I think he actually demolishes his palace, if I remember correctly. So he kind of she talks about how he's like a revisionist history king, and he was also the first Buddhist king, which previous, I guess, were Hindu. And this beret was built on a hill, so oftentimes half of it actually was empty. The higher elevation half was empty, and it rarely looked full.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of, I mean, poor planning, I guess you would say.
It was built for the spectacle and for the display of power and to align with the movement of the stars, essentially. So they want these things to be arranged the direction the stars are moving, so east to west.
But yeah, so he built this giant beret, but then I just wonder if half the time it was half empty. What were people thinking?
It probably looked really bad.
I would imagine so. I mean, it was huge.
Would have to smell extra bad then, too, I feel like, right?
Ooh, I didn't even think of that.
You have all that exposed ground that's underwater a lot of the time, and it's all, maybe you're in the jungle, so maybe that's just kind of what everything is, too. Kind of like Florida.
I knew you were going to say that, Tristan.
Yeah. Florida's a smelly place. So I could see that. Okay. And another thing that kind of got my goat was when he's talking about the beret, perhaps he wanted to signal that a new era had begun. He did it by erasing history beneath his new artificial seas of creation. And I don't think all the stuff he was removing, like what she was talking about him erasing mostly wasn't even like the more recent stuff, because there was some like ancient stuff under there. And she was talking about him building this to erase that stuff. And like, there's no way he was even aware that was there. Like, and he wouldn't probably have cared, but like to apply intent on that just kind of bothered me a little bit.
Right. I mean, we build up on history on a daily basis. You have to, right? You only have limited land.
Right.
And especially when you're working with this type of environment, it's probably easier to build where there's already been something built rather than expand into the jungle.
Well, and we have archaeologists and historical records, and we can see things were there a lot of the time. In this case, this stuff predated all their records, as far as I understood it, and he wouldn't have had any idea. And again, he wouldn't have cared, I'm sure, because it's just old junk if you can even recognize it as a settlement. It doesn't mean anything to them at that point. And then we move on to talking about inscriptions in the city, which I liked the discussion on the writing system involved here. But essentially, as you would see in a lot of other places, the official things that are written down really don't do a good job of telling us what life was like for everyday people. And that's what we see in Pompeii and other places as well. They're talking about the rulers and the big events, but as far as the everyday stuff, it's a little harder to get at.
Well, I like when she was talking about the inscriptions and how a lot of them were like bureaucrats praising their leaders or receipts of donations to the temple. Like that can tell us a lot, right?
Right.
But it doesn't really give us the day to day. And this is where she kind of starts talking about like data archaeology, which that was, we discussed this in the Pompeii chapter. We've never really heard that term before, but
it's a common idea, but it is just a different term than we've heard before.
Right. Yeah. But it allows us, it's gathering a lot of data, and then it kind of gives us a typical look at like the everyday lives of everyday people, like not one specific person, but a general description of how somebody would have lived their life during this time.
Yeah, if I can backpedal a little bit, because I found the whole writing system itself to be quite interesting here.
It was, yeah.
Because, so the temple inscriptions, as I understand, were made in Sanskrit, which comes from India. And the Western researchers at the time knew Sanskrit, And so that's what they focused on translating, is also on the temples. And they wanted to, the grand histories. They weren't interested in the common people at that point. But that's also what led to them believing that this was an Indianized society, because they were using this writing system. Whereas it turns out there actually is a Khmer writing system, but they didn't understand it or recognize it as important as I understood it. Does that sound right to you, Barbara?
Yep. And that seems pretty typical of early archaeology. You don't understand something, so it must not be important.
Right.
I might be being a little bit too critical. But yeah, so there was a Khmer language, but yeah, they didn't understand it. And they kind of thought of that as like the Indianization, where she talks about it was actually more of a like globalization of Angkor.
So one of the ways they start looking at this system is they start looking at who makes up what roles. In this case, for example, they started looking at what I guess the Westerners described as interminable lists of slaves. But in this case, they were tracking debt, essentially. And by looking at those lists, they can see that, 60% of the workers in temples were female. And these other details, like farming was mostly for women, and they had to work fortnights. So they would work 2 weeks at a period, and then they'd have 2 weeks off. So they were basically using the moon cycle to set up their work week. Festivals and rituals were also organized around the fortnight system, and paychecks and political cycles were also organized. And then she says if they were paid on a 2-week work schedule each month, what did they do for the other 2 weeks? She thought they would go home and basically their families would support them. And this got me set off on quite a tangent. I don't know if you picked up on it too, Barbara, but based on what she provides, I can already give 2 alternate explanations for what that is. Either they could have paid their workers so they sustained them for the weeks off, like we do in our society.
I was kind of like, okay,
right.
Yeah.
Or they feed and take care of them while they're working, and the pay was to sustain them while they were not working. And so I really started digging down and looked at some of the sources that she listed. And I found there's some big problems with this section, right? Actually, there's some like factual inaccuracies. For one thing, the fortnight system shows up in, I guess, just a few temples, but the source she cites explicitly says we can't know how widespread this was because most places don't talk about it. And so if presenting that as a common Khmer system for Angkor was a big stretch. I mean, you got to simplify it a little bit, and maybe I can forgive that a little bit. But that also explicitly says personnel in this temple were given reduced allowances when off duty, and these may have been sufficient to live on. And so the fact that the source, in trying to give a little bit of leeway here, it's a really interesting article, and I guess it's open source. So if you want to look it up, you can, and I'd like to recommend it, except it's really difficult to parse. And that could be what happened here a little bit, but I'm kind of on the fence on that because I don't want to give too much credit there. But it basically, the article itself is really cool because this whole system is way more complicated than we're seeing here.
I had a feeling that was the case because when I was reading that, I was like, well, why wouldn't they just use the money they just earned to sustain themselves for 2 weeks?
And the system of who gets what and when they get it. And that article really talks about, what we know, what we might know, how this might work. And like I said, it's kind of a difficult article to read, but it is really interesting. So if that's something you want to look into, check that out. But one thing that we do see that I thought was cool that she set up very nicely early on when she talked about how the villages that existed before Angkor were centered around a temple or a shrine. Essentially, these temples are set up the exact same way. There's the temple, and then there's a whole neighborhood around that temple, supporting that temple, and then the farms and things beyond that. And I thought that's interesting that you see that same pattern showing up even on this huge grand scale that you were seeing in those very, very basic villages. Culture is fascinating. I do love it. So they did do some testing of these neighborhoods around the temple. And in an 2015 excavation, they did find what they think was a brick stove and ceramic cooking vessels. And then again, with your favorite chemical analysis, Barbara, they found remains of palmetto fruit, rinds, seeds from ginger plant, and rice. So that just gives you kind of an idea of what sorts of diets people were experiencing there. And then she says these places were made the empire great, but they were also its vulnerability. Keeping people in line is a lot harder than keeping water contained in a beret.
I feel like both apparently were kind of hard.
I think it's kind of not backed up that it was both a problem.
Yeah, I think both were an issue because both contributed to the downfall, essentially.
Yeah, based on what we're seeing through the cities a lot is that if you have just one of these problems, it won't lead to the city's end. But both of them combined, or especially over a long period, is where you're going to kind of falter. It felt a little out of left field, that statement, to me.
I think sometimes she makes statements that might be a little bit too bold.
Yeah.
And I think, honestly, that is maybe to draw the reader in, to keep the reader interested. But as an archaeologist, we're probably a little bit more critical of those statements than your average reader.
I don't mind that she makes them and that it doesn't have like an academic article backing for it. But I would like to see at least implication of some evidence for some of the arguments she makes. I feel like sometimes she doesn't even imply that this comes from this researcher or, something like that. And I'm just seeing a lot more in this chapter, I feel, than the rest of the book so far.
So there was a portion where she talks about how the inscriptions made no mention of money, but that they interacted with other people, other cultures, and other groups that had money, and that they had the metal to make money. And I was a little confused on this part because I want to know, like she talks earlier about people being paid, right? I want to know during the excavations, did they find any money, any coins or anything like that? And she talks about how they used specific units of silver as a way to place value on things. And they also had math, including the number 0. And, they had ways of tracking debt. But then she goes on to talking about like a standard list of trade items and their value. Mm-hmm. This haul was just a little confusing to me just because
I feel like it was confusing because from what I was gathering, we don't really know. And so she's talking about some possibilities of how these things might have worked. And it's not a simple answer. There's basically signs that on the grand scale between the temples and the rulers, you were seeing almost a barter system. But they're thinking that that doesn't make a lot of sense necessarily if you're a temple worker. Like you said, they were interacting with people who did use coinage. So the thought is that maybe on a day-to-day scale, people were using just a mixed collection of coins.
Which commonly happened.
Which would make sense. And so people were just kind of aware of what the value of these different coins were.
But she talks about this and then there has to be some coins found, right? Like if you're using coinage, there's going to be, even if it's coins from another culture that you kind of are making use of for yourself.
If you were trading with another culture, there's going to be coins no matter what.
Right. I would have just loved to hear if they had found any coins as part of the excavation.
Well, it was basically a kind of specialized barter system as I understood it. So essentially there's kind of a large pool of valuable things and everyone just knows its worth. And this, jade piece is going to be worth this many bags of rice or this many chickens or whatever you're trying to buy. I felt like that sounded like it might work, but kind of like what you're saying, there wasn't really any evidence to supply that that's how it could have worked, right? Whereas you have presented two much simpler and more direct solutions already. I'm not sure what the point of that extra possibility was. It's also just a variation on the barter system, which he's already talked about too. Oh, actually, we do have, let me backtrack just a little bit, because that Chinese diplomat observed that on small scale trade did happen with coins. So that is actually recorded from other countries. So it seems like he didn't recognize that they were making their own, but they were trading coins from other countries. But then it becomes the problem of like, why did the temples don't talk about using coins? And so the idea is that maybe they were money wasn't used for either because of the scale they're working on, or maybe some other cultural reason they weren't using it. Then she says possibly because trade was women's work and not worth noting. And I didn't feel like the gender stratification of this society was established well enough to kind of justify that statement, right?
Agree. And also to say, so it wasn't worth noting, there are matriarchal societies. So I feel like making a generalized statement saying, women come secondary, a blanket statement like that is
and maybe I could believe it but you need to back that up a little bit more than that.
Yeah.
Because like in Pompeii, there was a whole discussion about women's place in that society and how that was changing and how it fit in. We haven't gotten that in this case. And so that statement, without any of that information, it just felt like it was an assumption that it worked like we would assume it would work rather than actually.
I feel like in this chapter overall, she was grasping at a lot more straws. And I think she's trying to make connections for things that we may not have enough information about the site or the culture to be able to do that.
Or she's almost maybe trying to talk about too much all at once and not able to focus in on the things that she, to really kind of back up what she's saying.
Yeah.
Because I find everything she talks about pretty fascinating, especially in this chapter. As far as like the stuff going on here, I think it's really cool, but I just have more problems than anywhere else with how are we able to say this, essentially.
Yeah.
We'll move on to the last section of this chapter. So about 200 years later, we have another king of the same name, in this case, gaining power by winning a battle for succession. He came from an outlying region, I thought this was kind of cool because a lot of the expansionist kings, she said, came from outlying regions. And the reason is those connections that they brought in with them enabled alliances and allowed for that power expansion. Whereas if they were from Angkor, they didn't necessarily have those connections in place already.
Yeah, and I guess that maybe could be seen as one of the results, I don't necessarily want to say benefits of, but due to the fact that there wasn't a firm line of succession, because if there was, right, everybody who was king or queen would be within Angkor already because they were part of that family or hierarchy or whatever. And so I guess this is one interesting way to allow for expansion.
This king is well known for a lot of things, doing a good job of maintaining the canals, portraying himself very favorably in the art. But in particular, what I'm going to try and say as Bengmele. But this was a palace complex, and actually a lot of it was an important shipping center, which is what really kind of got me interested because I thought this was kind of cool. So this is actually a kind of a crossroads from the Kulin Mountains, from sandstone quarries up there, and then an iron processing facility elsewhere. And so those two places come through here along with other goods and things as well. And there's all kinds of stuff. And so actually LiDAR found the quarry itself. And from what I understand, that was what led to our understanding of this as a trade center, essentially, because they found the quarry, then they were able to trace the river that ran straight to this place. So this place and Angkor Wat were both built out of the same sandstone, and in a lot of ways, this was kind of a precursor or trial run for Angkor Wat. So we see new kinds of archways and higher walls than normal, and these are all things that we also see in Angkor on I guess a bit more refined way. LiDAR did reveal two structures. I kind of thought this was cool that is so far unexplained. One is a rectangular maze pattern, and it's too shallow to be waterworks, and it's not even really connected to the network. So the best guess right now, and I like that this is laid out, the best hypothesis right now is that these were specialized garden for growing ritual plants. So essentially in the low points in this maze area, you could do lotus. On the higher points, you could do some aromatic trees such as sandalwood. The other structure that is still unexplained is what they call mound fields. And so these are near some of the biggest canals and reservoirs, and they're not full of garbage like the residential mounds are. So this is something different going on here. They're built for this purpose. It actually made me wonder if residential mounds were actually just garbage accumulation or were they constructed? I was a little unclear on that.
I was wondering about that too. And also something to consider is they're building all these canals, right? They had to dig them out. So they would have backfill. But the backfill you would expect because, they were continually expanding and, as we mentioned before, building on top of things that were there previously. You would expect there to be artifacts or something from previous occupation there.
I hadn't thought about that. Just simply backfill could be an explanation.
Yeah, but because
I didn't find the just mounds clearly the foundation of an elevated structure or structures. The whole clearly always kind of, again, unless you say clearly because we have found post holes up there, but again, we don't get any of that detail.
Right.
Clearly on its own is not necessarily a good argument.
But I would just imagine there'd have to be tons of backfill for the baileys and the canals and things like that. Like
Yeah.
what happened to all that dirt?
Yeah. And, if you're trying to raise areas up to be dry and stuff, I'm sure it got moved around, but
Yeah.
maybe that is possible. This was just a backfill reservoir, essentially, from those canals. I don't know. Because they also, all the dredging they do, that dirt had to go somewhere.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. But I liked that we ended on something that I was a little more enthusiastic about, because I really liked the discussion of how this kind of precursor to Angkor Wat was such an important hub, and how we know and how things all line up. And that I thought was especially cool and well supported. I think that's a big telling thing about how enthusiastic I was about that. Moving on to chapter 9. This is one I liked as well, because we start to get into a bit of how Westerners have interpreted the area and some of the problems with that, because colonialism has happened, essentially. So Angkor itself was first popularized in France in 1860, when a French explorer wrote about it. And essentially he described it as a lost city. And this happened right after France claimed Cambodia as a protectorate. And his discovery was basically used as a tool to popularize the colonization. So look at this cool place that we've got as a country now. He described the Cambodians as unappreciative of their history because they let it just fall apart and they don't care that this thing is here, and suggested that they were even too savage to have made Angkor itself, which my personal comment there was just classic.
Yeah.
That's just a classic colonization move right there.
Well, and it was interesting to me. So one of their theories was it had to be the ancient Egyptians or the Greeks.
Right.
Pray tell why.
Right. Right. And so that's a common theme. And if this was something that if it was going on today, they would have said aliens. So that is why we talked about how aliens has a little problematic. It is kind of a new form of this same idea that ancient peoples, especially ancient peoples who weren't European, were not capable of doing the things that they did.
And one thing that makes me so mad about this is they said that only European scientists could possibly study it because the Cambodians just allowed it to degrade. So it was the white man's burden to save this ancient city. And
this went on for like a century.
I know. And, as an archaeologist today, one of the most important things we do is talk to the people that are locals, and they can usually tell us a lot more about the area than we can even determine based on archaeological evidence, right? Because they have that oral tradition and the history and the understanding of the culture. And I was just like, ugh.
And he was there. He saw the monks that were still living there, the monks that actually the French displaced when they were taking over this site.
Yeah, I think that's really important to highlight is there were people still living there.
Yes, this was important.
And he came and he was like, look what I discovered.
Right. And this was a pilgrimage site. People knew it was there. They were going there for religious reasons. And so she does a really good job of talking about, even after Angkor was no longer a urban city, how it continued. So the royal family left in the 1400s. In the 1500s, a Cambodian king had some reliefs completed at Angkor Wat. Soon after that, even a Portuguese friar described Angkor and described it as being inhabited. In the 1600s, a Japanese pilgrim drew a map of the place. So even people from all around the region were coming to as pilgrimage. In the 1700s, a Cambodian dignitary even built a stupa, which is sounds like a kind of combination of a burial site / meditation site. Basically, it's well established that people from around the world knew of this place before this explorer came in.
Yep. And, we talked about the revisionist history, the revisionist king earlier on who, demolished part of, people's houses and temple and stuff. This here is what I consider revisionist history, right?
Right.
But, and we see this a lot, but at the Paris World Fair, which I think was in 1878, if I have the date right, they had an exhibit on ancient Khmer and on their art, and the French removed this art from Angkor and other sites and brought it to Paris to put it on display. And then the French came in and set up like permanent, like I guess research stations is the best way. That's kind of what I thought of it as, and took over supervision of all the archaeological work at Angkor. Apparently, that still exists today.
Mm-hmm. The
Which,
organization still exists.
yeah,
Hopefully it's changed a lot.
I hope so, but it kind of gave academic credibility to what they were doing.
Right.
Yeah, I hope things have changed.
And keep an eye out in the news for repatriation stories, because it is something I'm seeing a lot lately, and I'm really glad to see it. A lot of cases of things that in the U.S. that were in museums, sometimes for a long time, sometimes fairly recently, were bought and shouldn't have been bought, are being sent back. There are other countries that are doing it too. I will call out the British Museum for one that is not doing it, and people are really upset at them for very understandable reasons. But they're not alone in this problem either. So I'm not going to just say it's all them, but they're just the highest profile example.
But unfortunately, this has led to a lot of misinterpretation at the site. And one thing I've noticed is once you've misinterpreted something, it takes a lot to correct it.
Sure. We talked about Catalhayuk.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So it's
like
just...
in just a refresher, in Catalhayuk, the initial interpretation was that it was a matriarchal society, and because they had all the mother figurines, which in reality, they should have even known then were actually human figurines for the minority. And so basically that whole analysis doesn't hold up. And even like I thought that it was the case until I read that. So I had been taught that at some point too, that was how that society worked. And in reality, it wasn't at all, but that myth persists. And that is the same thing we're seeing here with Angkor as well.
Yeah. And it's just very frustrating.
So next we dive in and start looking at kind of what went wrong with the city. And this is where we start to see kind of also how the Western interpretation affected some of this as well. So research has shown there's a period of really frantically, increasingly complex repairs to the waterworks, a lot of more added and a lot happening in a very short period. And this was essentially, a lot of it was due to adding in more stuff as a politically good thing to do, but also climate instability was a big, I would say the major issue with that particular thing. But then there's also a lot of typical maintenance that had to happen as well. But none of that explains exactly why the city kind of fell apart as a city. And because they had been through that kind of stuff before, right? So, and as an example, it felt like an aside at first, but it's actually a reasonable example of kind of how this started going bad. There is a king in 928 CE that moved the whole capital to basically, I guess we aren't really sure why, but they think he might have come from that city. And so he built structures, another gigantic beret up there across a river, essentially, and blocked in several large rivers, and then built, I guess must have been quite an impressive temple and a palace and such as well. Unfortunately, there's some flooding that happened, and this topped the Beret dam, I guess. And it wasn't even just a top, it like washed out the whole thing. And so there's some frantic attempts to repair. And then we see there's another flood event that happens a few years later that just kind of wipes the thing out, and they give up at that point. And this is on a different scale because I felt like Angkor was a pretty well established system, whereas this was something they tried to do on the fly. And if it hadn't been for two unfortunate extra intense flood events, it might have stuck even, but they couldn't have known that from what I understood. But then there's some engineering deficiencies as well. I liked her description though of the purpose of this was a political display, because it was a major road would go along, basically I understood that the dam or along the Beret, and it's all cleared area in a jungle area, and you can see the palace spires and stuff of this whole like 7-kilometer trip, and it just keeps going and going. And I thought she painted a good picture there in my mind. I could kind of see that, how impressive that must have been.
Essentially, the dam fails. They tried to repair it, I guess possibly like multiple times, tried to repair it, didn't work. Seems like they all kind of, not all, but the capital returned to Angkor in 999 on 999. But I guess a small group still continued to live at the old temple. I think it's pronounced Kohker, Kohker. That's my best guess.
Mm-hmm.
So again, another example of a place being not quite fully abandoned, right? And then we have the Great King.
J7.
Yes. Oh, that's right. That's right. I forgot they do say that's right.
So this is the seventh king of this name. And apparently he shows up in so many records that a lot of archaeologists refer to him, and historians, I guess, refer to him as just J7.
Mm-hmm.
So we're okay just calling him J7.
I like that. Yes. Let's just, since it's been established as such, we're going to refer to him as J7. He was another expansionist king, probably the most successful. And apparently he was essentially, again, an outsider who had spent some years in exile in what is now Vietnam, and then returned and brokered peace and took the throne. And he was, I believe, the second Buddhist king. And I think this is the one, correct me if I'm wrong, but he's the one who made Buddhism the official religion.
He also declared himself Buddha incarnate.
That's right. Yes. Yes. And he filled the temple with Buddha statues.
With maybe his face, or maybe his face blended with Buddha's face. I think they're a little unclear on that.
Right. Yeah. And I found that interesting because when I visited Thailand, a lot of the temples had like Buddha everywhere. So that's kind of what I was envisioning. I don't know. I didn't get a chance to go to Cambodia and see Angkor Wat's on my list, but I just had these images in my mind. Probably might be completely incorrect.
I like the bit about the pathways through the city and the niches that were out there. This was a political and social maneuver as well, but there are 400 some niches with Buddha-based images, and essentially these images were given to provincial centers, and then for religious reasons they had to have them bring them back every year to consecrate them. So you are forcing your governors and outlying rulers to return to the capital to kind of pay service and consecrate these things again, and that allows for a lot of political connections and discussions and stuff, and people you may not see very often otherwise. Thought it was kind of clever in a way.
And I looked up some images of, I guess, what is left of the pathways and stuff. Very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool.
This king also enforced a grid layout, which was another power move, apparently. By reordering it, you were just kicking people out of their homes so you could restructure how things were laid out. But by doing that, then you can control how much they get back, or do they get any back? Or, you can, if people are a problem, you can just take their land and they don't get it back. To me, it sounds like, well, this guy was pretty clever at manipulating this stuff, but at least in the books suggests that he may have upended that debt and patronage system so badly that it kind of wrecked everything by doing this, because it was he just changed too much too quickly, and it kind of wrecked that system that was maybe already pretty fragile.
Yeah, I kind of thought of it as like almost like an overcorrection, but I guess he died. And then this was interesting to me. His son briefly took over, which I think this is the first time
that we've seen anyway.
Yeah,
I got an impression it happened occasionally, but it wasn't the norm.
Yeah, so I was like, oh, okay, here we go. This is more like what we as Westerners think of, but I guess he only briefly took over. But then they go on to talk about the term I used earlier, cascading network of failures. So but
this is a slow decline over at least a couple centuries, right?
Right, yes. But as I mentioned at the beginning, they built all these canals to kind of redirect water flow to supposedly where they needed it, although sometimes that isn't very clear. And in doing so, there were just so many issues. And one of them was like the clogging of a lot of these canals due to like sediment, which I think is probably from the flooding and maybe from poor engineering.
Before we get into that, though, there's a little bit talking about how there was actually a pretty big loss of territory at this time, too, which I felt was really important.
True.
Bit of detail, because it was basically they were losing power, but also because their power was human labor, they were losing labor force. And that labor force was critical for maintaining the infrastructure of Angkor. So when you have fewer and fewer people, it becomes more and more drain on the people who are still available to maintain that. Again, that to me, it's like, that sounds like cattle hiding.
I was just going to say that.
Because that's the exact same thing. Maintaining this network of buildings that no one's living in became more and more effort for people who were still there, till finally people just kind of seemed to give up. And I just thought that was an important connection to our previous one as well. But then we get into problems with the canals and the climate and everything as well, because it wasn't just that thing. course.
Yeah, but I mean, that's a good point, though, because when you have, sediment that's regularly clogging your canals, having people that are able to remove that sediment is really important.
Right.
They didn't have that. And every leader was building their own canal systems and things like that. And in some cases, it actually drew water away from where it needed to be. And I know they probably did understand, at least have some understanding of their geology. I think it just happened so slowly that they didn't necessarily make note of it or think that it was as big a deal as it was, maybe.
Right. So what led to that was a multi-decade drought, which sounds kind of crazy. And so because of that, they built extra canals. They need to pull in more water because they have to have the water to maintain the city, essentially. That's how I understood it.
Yeah.
But then that drought ended, and now they've got way too much water. They have an incredible, intense monsoon that floods everything and clogs canals with debris. And so now they have to get water out of the city. And so they build canals to drain things. And then they have another multi-decade drought. And all that combined, you can see how that could really be quite an intense hit on the city. And she actually does a good job of talking about, even with modern cities, when they get hit repeatedly by big storms, she says they never seem to really get back to baseline GDP, even with modern technology and everything today. I thought that was actually a pretty good connection there, an important connection as well.
Kind of worrisome.
Yeah.
Considering we live in Florida.
Infrastructure is expensive. And basically any civilization will follow pieces in this scenario. Right
yeah,
here.
It doesn't matter how wealthy that civilization or country or however you want to think of it is. It slowly just kind of gives way under constant onslaught of storms or climactic events. What did she call it? Sandcastle depreciation?
Yeah. But yeah, talking about our cities today, especially Florida cities that are dealing with king tides and things that they haven't had to deal with before, their sewer systems and things are built for a certain situation. And now that situation has changed and they aren't functioning as intended anymore. But changing those systems is something that happened over decades or centuries. And just changing those all on the fly is, you can't just do that, especially when you've got cases where like you've got buildings built over tops of sewers and things. It's not something you can just go in and fix necessarily.
Yeah, and like you have people living there, right? So it's not like you can
Right.
just be, we're not going to use the sewers today. We're going to repair them. You can't do that. And then the money that it would cost to do so just isn't there.
Yeah. And so laying that out in a modern way, I thought was really good, because that really emphasized how big of a problem this was. This was not a small scale failing that was unique to this civilization. This is something that anyone does have problems.
And she also meant, in addition to all of that, people were leaving because it was just easier to live elsewhere. And so they weren't paying taxes in Angkor. And so that led to the loss of money to fund the repairs needed to, help the issue, help relieve the issue. So it's kind of, it literally is a cascade of failures. But I also think it's interesting because, we've mentioned climate change and climactic events and our modern infrastructure today. But archaeology shows us that some of the issues we're dealing with in modern society are not new.
Right.
We have in the past tried to deal with these. And I think that's just something to keep in mind. As the saying goes, if we don't learn history, we are doomed to repeat it.
Well, still think we are possibly doomed to repeat it. But
oh, we are 100%.
we have a chance to not, but
right.
we probably will. I think we've kind of said that before, too.
And that actually brings me to something, because when I was reading this portion, it was after you and I were at an event where we were talking to parents. And I was talking with a couple parents about how history is taught and how we are taught to memorize dates and people and important events, but we aren't necessarily taught in school to link those events and look at the cause and the effect of how one event may impact another event. So I'm also wondering, if one of the reasons that we are potentially doomed to repeat history is the way that we are taught history.
Yeah. So as the city is going through all this stuff, there's also a lot of political turmoil. They were weakened to the point where they were easily invaded. And finally, the royal family left in the mid 1400s. But importantly, the laboring classes stayed behind and kept working on the city. And this is where we see some of the grand buildings actually recycled and used for mundane everyday stuff, which I thought was pretty cool. And actually, I find more interesting than the grand gestures that they were meant to portray.
But it also, going back to when we were talking about the French and when they came and they said, oh, these people don't appreciate their history. It's not that they didn't appreciate it. Right. It's that they needed that resource. And that was an more easily available resource than going to a quarry and cutting new stone.
And this is my conjecture here, but this is stuff built by the people that abandoned us here. It doesn't have any purpose anymore. I might as well use it. That's would be a reasonable thing to do.
It's practical.
Yeah.
I think, and people tend to be pretty practical most of the time.
There's as groups anyway, I feel like there's always a reason for things happening.
Yeah.
Right. Even if they don't seem like they make sense, like the positioning of the berets, there was a good reason for it that probably needed to happen. Like they needed to that political authority that those gave you, even if they didn't work out, and if they ended up resulting in the downfall of the city. That's kind of how I assume things usually go anyway. But eventually, even the working classes started to leave. Then you have less and less people to help maintain things, and people that left returned to village life, which again, kind of like cattle hayuk, right? People leave the city and they go back to the smaller villages. There's some evidence the royal family tried to move back to Angkor. There was some new construction stuff, but apparently this didn't last very long.
Did you pick up on the, I thought it was interesting that they started to practice a different type of Buddhism where the temples, I guess, used to be passed down like from the elites to other elites, I guess. But in this form of Buddhism, it's owned by the community. And
anyone who becomes a monk there has to forego all family ties.
Right. Yeah. So I thought it was interesting, and it kind of fits with what was happening at the time. It seems like, again,
there's an interesting connection there. I would like to see a little more of how that developed.
Yeah.
Right.
But it just seems to fit with what was occurring at the time.
Like a probable or possible interpretation.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. And one thing I really wanted to talk about, but we missed somehow, is the importance of Khmer researchers on the interpretation of Angkor. I'm not sure where that was exactly, but essentially, I remember the French had their interpretation, and they interpreted the writing as, like we said, Indian writing, and there was no Khmer culture itself. But then there are Khmer researchers that went in and actually analyzed the stuff that was not Sanskrit and developed that, and just blew open our understanding of this whole society. And that, I thought, was just a really critical detail that needs to happen more in our interpretation of the past. And there is a lot of effort into achieving that. But I would say, even the last couple decades is when we really started to see that stuff. It's very recent. Yeah. It hasn't been going on very long, unfortunately.
Yeah, she goes on and she talks a little bit about how a lot of the artifacts are in storage to protect them currently from looters and the Khmer Rouge forces.
Those forces don't exist anymore. I think they did damage in the past. But they're not around now.
But I know there is still like some political issues between Cambodia and like Thailand and stuff too. So I don't know if that plays into it. But yeah, and we see that happening a lot of times. Archaeological sites are looted to provide funds for military forces. I don't know what you would,
for straight up terrorism.
Yeah. And so you see that a lot. We've seen that in the Middle East a lot.
Which is why, if you've seen it in the news, a big collection purchased by a certain craft store here in the U.S. from the Middle East was a big deal, because it turned out that what they were buying was connected to, I think, ISIS.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I just thought it was important to point that out, just because it's something we don't necessarily think about. I wouldn't think about it if I wasn't an archaeologist, but things that are sold on the black market oftentimes have connections to things that are human rights violations, things of that nature.
And even on a more local scale, things we see here in the U.S., a lot of the looting of sites is for drugs. Mm-hmm. And that's been pretty well established. So it is definitely a problem. that goes beyond just the looting of the site even. It's a societal problem on a bigger scale too.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else?
Well, I just thought there was one quote in there. Angkor isn't a lost civilization. It's the living legacy of ordinary people who refuse to give up. A little, again, idealistic.
A little poetic.
Yes. Yeah. But I think the fact that it isn't a lost civilization, I think is important to note. But yeah, the rest of that quote is just a little, I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I enjoyed this chapter despite it having some issues, and I feel like it maybe wasn't as focused as the previous two, but I think also it being such a complex site, not that the other ones weren't complex, but maybe we know more about those sites than, but it just seemed a little bit different than the other two.
I think I had the most issues with the second chapter. I did like that this tied in better, I felt, to her overall theme of why cities kind of fall apart, but actually don't disappear. They just become something different.
Right. Yeah.
I felt like Pompeii didn't really fit that idea. And whereas this one fits that idea very nicely, and the parallels between Angkor's decline and Catalhayuk's decline are pretty stark, pretty well laid out. I think she did a nice job on that. Despite my issues earlier that I talked about, I liked this quite a bit. And it was a good opportunity to learn about a city that I didn't really know anything about.
Yeah, I've heard of it, and I visited other temples, but I didn't really know much about this. And it's funny because I was thinking about how much I didn't know about the temples that I visited when I visited them, and I still don't.
Right.
But I am curious to see how this will line up with our next and final chapter.
Which is one that we probably know the most about.
Probably.
Yeah, still a lot to learn. I'm not an expert on this by any means, but our next section is about the North American city urban environment, which is Cahokia, which is actually, I have visited this one, and we have vestiges of this civilization that ran Cahokia actually down here in Florida. So they had a huge territory.
I am interested because I thought I knew a lot about Pompeii, and then we read that chapter and there was a lot I didn't know. So I'm hoping that in this chapter, I kind of come away with that same thought.
Well, and a lot of what I learned about Cahokia would have been when I was in undergrad, which was early 2000s. I'm curious to see what's been learned since, because that was before LiDAR and GPR, ground penetrating radar, was rare. You know, I wonder what we will have figured out, because as I recall, there wasn't a good answer as to why that urban environment, I'm reluctant to call it a city at this point because I don't know if it applies, but why that urban environment kind of declined and why that civilization changed anyway, because it's pretty well established it didn't disappear, but it just became something different,
right,
as is the theme of this book overall.
Yep.
So yeah, come back next time and we will explore all those questions.
All right, happy reading, everybody.
Archaeology Books for Fun is brought to you by the Florida Public Archaeology Network, a program of the University of West Florida. You can find out more about archaeology and about FPAN at fpan.us. We appreciate any feedback, so if you're listening to us as a podcast, please leave us a review, and if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Thanks for listening.